Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick, back for the last time to look at some new content for X-Wing 2nd Edition, because after this video we will have revealed everything that's dropping in Wave 1. Today we're going to cover all the talents, plus a few things I missed yesterday. Another apology guys, I'm still a bit under the weather. Sorry for missing the cannons and the barrage rockets yesterday, we'll make sure we get through everything today. Thank you so much for all your patience. Let's begin with the barrage rockets, which takes up 2 missile slots, is a 3 red dice attack out the front arc, range 2 to 3, attack, focus, spend 1 charge, of which you have 5. If the defender is in your bullseye firing arc, you may spend 1 or more charge to reroll that many attack dice. So this is cool. It's not as infinitely recursive as the old unguided rockets, which basically can be used as many times as possible, but the effect is much better. You can modify your dice through means other than just using that focus token. Now you have to have a focus token in order to do this attack, so there is probably less chance that there'll be other things like target locks on your ship, but that is a possibility and added upside. Plus any passive effects like Lone Wolf or Predator, you can still modify your dice with that. And I think having the inbuilt ability and flexibility rather to give yourself rerolls with those charges is going to be great. I feel like on average you probably want to try and get this off 2 to 3 times a game with consistent attacks, but if your ship's about to explode and it's got a whole heap of charges on it, you'll waste it. You may as well get value out of those charges, and from that point of view it looks like there's a lot of flexibility with this. A lot of agency to adapt to a lot of different situations. If you're forced to spend those tokens, you'll be happy to. Also, I do like there's a hard ceiling on this. The old unguided rockets felt like a good design, I liked it, but it was basically a way to give ships with lots of ordnance but only a 2 dice red primary, basically a better primary attack. Although it technically wasn't a primary attack, it kind of was because you never had to spend anything. And that was really to address power creep more than anything else. Barrage rockets feels much more like its own thing. I don't think it's going to be that handy with reload. I will say that having to dump a lot of charges at once doesn't feel like reload's going to be your best friend, especially taking a weapons disable token, not taking a focus or evade token. If your opponent can pressure you, it's going to be very hard to recharge this with reload actions. So it might just be a case of you get a few rockets off a game and that is it. And moving on to the cannons, the heavy laser cannon works exactly the same way as it always did, except it now only works in the bullseye firing arc, which I actually think is really good because we have a real potential here to get the points down on this guy. And if Heavy Laser Cannon is a cheaper upgrade overall, I feel like there's a lot more lists that will be wanting to take him. Especially when we're looking at lower cost ships like, I don't know, B-Wing or Skik Fighters or something like that. Heavy Laser Cannon was a staple on several large ships. RG-88, for example, loved Heavy Laser Cannon, but at the 7-point cost, it was really a bit overbloated for something like a Skik Interceptor, especially the Cartel Spaces. So if we can justify it being a bit cheaper, only firing the bullseye firing arc, that could be good. Plus, I do want to note, just based on people's reaction of this, I think people are severely underrating things that only work in the bullseye firing arc. I don't think it's going to be as rare as a lot of you guys seem to think. It means you have to fly better in order to do this kind of thing, but there are plenty of scenarios where you're just straight up jousting with your opponent, charging directly at each other. And in those scenarios, your opponent is going to be punished because you have agency to really capitalize off them being directly in front of you. And even in games where you're not, well, you can fly better and get people in your bullseye firing arc. I think it's going to happen a bit more frequently than people are giving it credit for anyway. The ion cannon is the same as every other ion effect in the game, the ion torpedoes, turret, and ion missile, where you get an attack and only one of the damage hits, then all the overflow damage turns into ion tokens. It's a 3 red attack dice at the front arc at range 1 to 3. Pretty standard stuff. I think it's a fair adaptation of the old ion cannon, speaking of which, because the old ion cannon always dealt 1 damage and 1 ion token, and against aces that was fantastic, because it meant if you only hit them with 1 single just regular damage, you got even more upside for your card. That wasn't so great against ships with lots of health. If you had like a large ship on your opponent's squad you want to do a lot of damage to, ion cannon may not necessarily always be your friend unless you have a whole heap of them. But the new ion cannon seems to scale well depending on what ships you're fighting against, which is good. Plus you do get that range bonus, so if you're fighting range 1 against a large ship, you can get a lot of ion tokens onto it. Jamming beam and tractor beam actually work the same way now. Basically all of their damage turns into their respective tokens. Particularly on tractor beam, I like this quite a lot because it means you do have the ability to tractor a large ship right off the bat, or a medium ship. It seems to scale nicely. If you get into range 1, there's a great chance you'll manage to get a large ship onto a rock, which is going to feel really, really good. And jamming beam's really interesting because jam effects do not scale with ship size. One jam token negates one of your opponent's tokens, so if you get multiple tokens under them, you can potentially shut down several of their tokens, which could be really powerful in some situations. I think more often than not, the extra tokens aren't going to be your friend, but if you happen to come up against an ace that has multiple tokens, which can happen in some rare situations in 2nd edition, yes, this is going to be fantastic. Okay, and moving on to the talents. Now, we have a lot of stuff to cover here, so I won't spend too much time introducing this. Crack Shot works exactly the same way, except it's now only in the bullseye firing arc. Again, I think that's still a powerful effect. I think on multiple TIE fighters, this is still going to see play. Depends on the costing to try and justify that points buy-in. In 1st edition, it was only 1 point, and that basically led it to see a lot of play, because 1 point for 1 point of damage is generally a good trade-off in 1st edition, so we'll see how it's balanced out in 2nd edition. Daredevil works pretty much exactly the same way, except now it only works on small ships, thankfully in the case of Decimators anyway, and now you cannot perform this unless you have the white boost on your action bar, so you don't get agency to move around ships that really have no business using this effect. Debris Gambit, in my opinion, is much, much better than it used to be. When this was revealed late last year, action assign 1 evade token to your ship for each obstacle at range 1, max 2, I thought, no, this is pretty average. There's plenty of situations where you're just not going to get any tokens, no agency to get these evade tokens, and it pretty much telegraphs where your ship wants to fly. It is not worth an action to get what should be a passive effect in my eyes. To be playable anyway. The new version gives you a red evade, plus if you happen to be near a rock, it turns into a white evade, which is much, much more applicable in my eyes. It always bothered me, the idea of just a card that gives a ship evade. I feel like that's too easily abusable, but if it scales with the way you fly, that feels very fair. And just the red evade without the extra text, I feel is a very valuable talent. It'll depend on the costing, of course, but I much, much prefer the design on this card now. Elusive gives your ship a bit of flexibility. It means you get to have rerolls on defense, and whenever you get red dice, you get to use this ability multiple times, which feels really, really good. The old Elusive actually wanted you to specifically not do red maneuvers, which is interesting. Plus, it interacted with your opponent's dice instead of your own. And I think FFG want to lean away from that a bit. Making your opponent reroll dice is what's commonly associated with a negative play experience, so I can understand leaning away from that. Expert Handling is one of these cards that upgrades a red action to a white action. Very similar to the old Vectored Thrusters or Expert Handling. They've kind of mushed this design into one card and done it in a nice balanced way. And Intimidation is functionally the same. It's basically telling your opponent to roll 1 less defense dice. And that's good because reducing agility doesn't work against ships with 0 agility. But if your opponent's ship has 0 agility and they're fighting through a rock or at range 3, they still lose that defense dice. So it's a little bit more powerful. Juke is a functional reprint, apart from the costing that we don't know yet. And this is really, really good, especially on the TIE Defender. I think Juke is going to see a lot of play if it's costed efficiently enough. There's no other ship in the game that really gets to cheat on free evade tokens. If Omega Leader and Com Relay is still a thing in 2nd edition, and I doubt it will be quite as efficient as it was in 1st edition. Yes, Duke will see play on that probably, but in terms of consistent meta play, I can see this being an absolute bomb on the TIE Defender. Lone Wolf is a bit more applicable, but a little less oppressive, where you only get 1 reroll per turn, but you can reroll any dice. It's not just blank results, which is nice. Marksmanship has had a severe upgrade in my eyes. The old one required you to spend an action, and now the new one gives you a Mangler Cannon-esque ability where you get to upgrade a hit result to a crit result, but only in the bullseye firing arc. Interestingly enough, Predator also gives you an offensive boost in the bullseye firing arc. And I think it'll be telling on the way these are costed. If they're costed the same, I think there's pretty much going to be a strong consensus over which card you should take. I feel like if we have the choice, we generally want Predator because we in general want more results than upgrading the quality of our results. But I don't know, if the card's 1 or 2 points cheaper, I can see them both being applicable in situations. Plus, this seems like a strong card to use on Bosk. Outmaneuver is exactly the same, apart from the fact that when we're talking about your firing arc, it must be your forward firing arc, which makes sense. The flavour of this card is a small, nimble ship that's trying to outmaneuver their opponent. Not really talking about big ships with multiple firing arcs, being able to span a lot of things. Like on the Fire Spray in 1st edition, this was a semi-viable card, not because you could physically outmaneuver your opponent, just because you had so much scope with those firing arcs, and if your opponent tried to turn away, you could punish them, which is not what the card's all about. Predator, I mentioned before, you only get one reroll. You don't get the extra reroll if you're fighting against low PS ships, but I think that's fair enough. I think the costing will reflect how that works. Saturation Salvo is now no longer the word salad that it once was. While you perform a torpedo or missile attack, you may spend 1 charge from that upgrade. If you do, choose 2 defense dice. The defender must re-roll those dice. And this is very similar to Barrage rockets, where you get more agency to just spend the tokens on your card, and you get a certain degree of flexibility. Again, if your ship's being highly pressured, if it's likely to be taken off the table soon, you can get value out of those extra charges you haven't spent yet, which is good. However, I will point out there actually is a little bit of downside in this card that you guys may not have spotted. You must choose 2 defense dice. So if your opponent only rolled 1 evade, you must choose another dice that may have a blank result in it, and there is a little bit of a risk that they'll actually get more evade results. Now, of course, you can choose not to use this card at all in those situations, so you can play around that, but there will always be those events where you just get stung by this slightly and you actually manage to upgrade your opponent's dice. Just watch out for that one, guys. Plus, this only goes on ships with reloads, so only on ships that really want to play around with ordnance. Squad Leader is a little bit less powerful in that the coordinate action is only red and the coordinated ship can only do things on your action bar, except you no longer have to worry about only applying it to ships lower pilot skill than you, which kind of opens up the list building potential in this card, which I like. That was always an annoying clause in the first one, and I'm glad they got rid of it. Swarm Tactics is a functional reprint, barring costings. I never really thought Swarm Tactics was a great deal for 2 points in an EPT slot, but yeah, we'll see how it goes in 2nd edition. Maybe a cheaper costings could make this a bit more relevant. Trickshot again is a functional reprint, barring costings. I could easily see this go up to 1 point, the equivalent of a half point in 1st edition. It's a decent effect, and not too many things get to basically upgrade the raw amount of dice you fire, even if it is conditional. Last but not least, we have a cycle of cards, 1 for each faction. And I'm very curious to see what happens when Wave 2 comes out and we have Resistance in First Order, whether they get a copy of something like this on their factions. Fearless is the scum card that works the same way as it always did, except instead of adding a result, you change one of the results, and instead of a ship being inside any of your arcs and you being inside any one of their arcs, it is specifically the forward firing arc, which again is probably honing this in terms of flavour. I don't think Fearless was an entirely outrageous card in 1st edition. I mean, I love to fly with it, but I understand it wasn't a very high tier meta card. So it feels a little bit harsh, nerfing it a little bit, but at the same time, keeping the flavour there feels relevant. And I don't know, if it's only the 1 point and goes down by half a point in old speak, that could be good. Ruthless is interesting. You now no longer have to damage a ship next to your opponents, except now when you do, you actually get to upgrade the attack dice. So you are rewarded from doing this. You're rewarded for going after multiple ships, which seems like a pretty decent upgrade for this card. I think it's going to have to be more expensive to reflect that. Being able to get passive dice mods is fantastic. Against swarms, this is going to be fantastic. And it still works on non-primary attacks. Yeah, seems very powerful. Selfless works exactly the same way as it always did, except you now only get to cancel 1 critical result for a matching critical result on your opponent. You don't get to cancel a whole heap of generic hit results, which seems a lot less powerful, but at the same time, if you're pairing this on something like Biggs Darklighter or Lowrick, there could be a lot of value to get out of this card, so that seems pretty cool. And again, just like Fearless, if this is costed appropriately, it might adjust the power level so it's just in the right sweet spot. And there we have it, guys. That is every upgrade card and pilot card from X-Wing 2.0 for the first wave. I hope you enjoyed my coverage of this, guys. I really enjoyed going through it. As much work as it was, I do love doing this kind of stuff. We have Gen Con in about a month's time, and my prediction going forward is at Gen Con, we are hopefully, fingers crossed, going to see a reveal of Wave 2, which would be absolutely awesome. Also at Gen Con, I'm hoping by that stage we get our costings on all these cards, or at least some of them, so we have a bit of a preliminary idea about where these sit in terms of list building. I'm not going to go through every single card again once we have costings, but I will talk about the power level in general. I'm specifically looking at the pilot cards. When we have costings, we're going to know how much they sort of tend to favour aces. One of the things that FFG spoke about when they mentioned the new costings in the app, they're actually going to make aces more heavily weighted, so like your Sunterfells, your Kylo Rens, and your Corran Horns, all that kind of stuff, are going to be relatively more expensive than the lower PS guys, and that's going to make an interesting curve in terms of the way those are costed. And I think if they can do that kind of stuff right, they can actually make more of the pilots on every ship more relevant. And of course, they always have the ability to tweak that later. So still a lot to look forward to. No new cards to talk about until we get Wave 2 spoiled. In the meantime, guys, thank you so much for watching this coverage. Like and subscribe. Like me on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter and Reddit. And I will catch you guys later.